October 17, 1943. Somewhere inside the operations hut at Kahili airfield on the southern tip of Bougainville, a Japanese radio operator adjusted his frequency and heard something that did not belong there. An American voice, calm, unhurried, almost amused, was speaking in English on an open channel. The voice was not calling for reinforcements. It was not relaying coordinates. It was not doing anything that a combat pilot was supposed to do over enemy territory. It was taunting them. The voice said, in words that multiple American pilots and intelligence officers later recalled, that he was right over their airport. He told them to come up and fight. He said it the way a man leans against a bar and tells the room he will take on anyone who stands up. Not angry, not desperate. Conversational. As if the 60 Japanese fighters parked on the runway below him were an invitation he had been waiting for all week. Outside, visible through the tree line, 24 American Corsairs were circling the airfield in a wide, deliberate orbit. They were not diving, they were not strafing, they were circling, slowly, patiently, as if they had nowhere else to be and nothing better to do than wait for someone to accept the challenge. A Japanese voice came back on the frequency, accented but clear. It asked the American for his position. The American replied that he had already told them his position. He was directly above them. The Japanese voice asked again. The American repeated himself, and this time, according to accounts recorded after the war, he added a profanity and a second invitation to come up and settle the matter. What happened next entered the official records of the United States Marine Corps and, eventually, the text of a Medal of Honor citation. More than 30 Japanese fighters scrambled from Kahili and the surrounding strips to answer the challenge. In the dogfight that followed, the Americans claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single plane. Those numbers, as we will see, deserve scrutiny. Wartime claims on both sides of the Pacific were routinely inflated, but the radio challenge itself is beyond dispute. It is written into the highest military honor the United States can bestow, and the man who made that challenge, the voice on the frequency, was a Marine major named Gregory Boyington, barely past 30, a man the press called Pappy, a man his pilots called Gramps, and a man whose entire life, before and after that morning, was a study in contradictions so deep that even the people who knew him best could not reconcile them. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe, because the stories on this channel are worth hearing more than once. Boyington was not the first American pilot to show aggression over the Solomon Islands. By the autumn of 1943, the air war in the South Pacific had been raging for more than a year, and both sides had produced aces, men with 5 or more confirmed kills, who flew with extraordinary skill and nerve. The Japanese had men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Saburo Sakai. The Americans had Joe Foss and Marion Carl. Aggression in the air was expected. It was the nature of fighter combat. But what Boyington did over Kahili was something else entirely. He did not simply attack the enemy. He announced that he was coming. He gave them time to prepare. He circled their own airfield, the place where they were strongest, where their anti-aircraft guns could reach him, where they could scramble every available fighter to meet him, and he dared them to do exactly that. The tactical logic of this was, on its surface, insane. Every principle of air combat since the First World War said that surprise was the greatest advantage a pilot could hold. You attacked from the sun. You struck before the enemy knew you were there. You did not circle his base and introduce yourself on the radio. And yet it worked. Not once, but repeatedly. Because the Kahili challenge was not a single act of recklessness. It was a tactic. A deliberate, calculated tactic that Boyington used again and again over the skies of Bougainville and later over Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese airbase in the South Pacific. He would orbit an enemy airfield. He would taunt the defenders on the radio, and when they rose to meet him, he would be waiting in the position he had chosen, at the altitude he wanted, with his squadron arranged exactly the way he needed them. The question this video answers is not simply what happened over Kahili. That part is a matter of record. The question is, what kind of man does this? What combination of skill, recklessness, desperation, and calculation produces a combat leader who tells the enemy exactly where he is and then beats them when they come to find him? The answer, as you will see, is far stranger than the legend, because the man behind that voice was not the natural-born warrior the newspapers described. He was something more complicated, more broken, and in the end, more remarkable than any Hollywood version of his life has ever managed to capture. The answer starts not in the cockpit of a Corsair, but in a small town in northern Idaho, with a boy who did not know his own last name. Gregory Boyington was born on December 4, 1912, in Coeur, Idaho. His father was Charles Barker Boyington, a dentist. His mother was Grace Gregory. They divorced when Gregory was an infant, and his mother married a man named Ellsworth Hallenbeck. From that point forward, the boy was raised as Gregory Hallenbeck. He did not know he had a different biological father. He did not know his real surname. He grew up in the logging town of St. Maries, Idaho, believing he was someone he was not. He discovered the truth only when he needed his birth certificate to apply for military aviation training. The document said Boyington, not Hallenbeck. The discovery, by his own later account, shook something loose in him. The boy who had grown up certain of who he was learned that the most basic fact of his identity, his name, had been a fiction. Whether that revelation explains what came later is a question biographers have argued about for decades. But it is worth noting because the pattern, the gap between who Gregory Boyington appeared to be and who he actually was, repeated itself for the rest of his life. There was, however, one early experience that pointed directly at the man he would become. At the age of 6, in Coeur d'Alene, he took his first airplane ride with a barnstorming pilot named Clyde Pangborn. Pangborn was a local aviator who would later, in 1931, complete the first non-stop trans-Pacific flight, landing a Belanca monoplane called Miss Vidal in a wheat field in East Wenatchee, Washington, after flying from Japan. The boy who climbed out of Pangborn's cockpit that afternoon was not the same boy who had climbed in. Something had taken hold. The family moved to Tacoma, Washington, where Boyington attended Lincoln High School. He was a wrestler, a swimmer, and by every account a young man who did not walk away from confrontation. He enrolled at the University of Washington in 1930, joined the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity, served in the Army Reserve Officers Training Corps, and won a Pacific Northwest Intercollegiate Middleweight Wrestling Championship. He earned a degree in aeronautical engineering in 1934. He went to work at Boeing in Seattle as a draftsman and engineer, designing the aircraft that other men would fly. He married Helene Wickstrom in 1934. They had 3 children. The marriage did not last. By the time the war began reshaping every life in America, Boyington was drinking heavily, short on money, and looking for a way out of a civilian life that was closing in on him. He had earned a commission as a second lieutenant in the Coast Artillery Reserve in 1934, and then enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1935. He was accepted as an aviation cadet in 1936 and designated a naval aviator on March 11, 1937. Flying, it turned out, was the thing he was built for. Everything else, marriage, money, sobriety, stability, seemed to slide off him. But in a cockpit, the contradictions resolved. The restlessness became useful. The aggression became a skill. By 1941, Boyington was a first lieutenant in the Marines, trained, qualified, and going nowhere slowly. He was also divorced, in debt, and facing the kind of dead end that leads a certain type of man to do something drastic. The drastic thing arrived in the form of a recruiter from the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, a civilian front for a covert American military operation in China. The operation was called the American Volunteer Group. The press would call them the Flying Tigers, and for Boyington, they represented something irresistible: a fresh start, combat flying, and a paycheck large enough to clear his debts. He resigned his Marine Corps commission in late August of 1941, signed a 1-year contract, and sailed for Burma. The American Volunteer Group, commanded by a retired Army Air Corps officer named Claire Chennault, was one of the most unusual military formations in American history. Its pilots were officially civilians, recruited from the Navy, Marines, and Army Air Corps, with the quiet approval of President Roosevelt. They flew Curtiss P-40 fighters, with shark mouths painted on the engine cowlings, and operated from primitive airfields in Burma and southern China against the Japanese air forces that were sweeping across Southeast Asia. Boyington arrived in the autumn of 1941 and flew with the 1st Squadron, known as the Adam and Eves. He saw combat over Rangoon in early 1942, and by his own account, he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. That number is important, and it is also disputed. The American Volunteer Group's official records, compiled by its intelligence staff, credited Boyington with 3.5 victories, 2 confirmed air-to-air kills over Rangoon on February 6, 1942, plus shared credit for aircraft destroyed on the ground during a raid on Chiang Mai. Boyington always maintained the higher number. The Marine Corps, when it later calculated his career total, accepted his personal claim. Historians have not. What is not disputed is that Boyington left the American Volunteer Group under a cloud. He clashed with Chenault. He drank. He fought with other pilots. He broke his contract before its term was up and departed in the spring of 1942, heading back to the United States with combat experience, a reputation for trouble, and exactly the kind of record that made military bureaucracies nervous. The experience in Burma taught Boyington things that no training syllabus could replicate. He had fought against the Japanese Zero at a time when most American pilots had never seen one. He had learned its strengths, its extraordinary maneuverability, and its ability to climb and turn inside anything the Allies were flying in 1942. But he had also learned its weaknesses. The Zero was fast and nimble because it was built light. It carried no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A short burst of .50 caliber fire in the right place could turn it into a fireball, and it could not follow an American fighter in a high-speed dive without its control surfaces locking up. These were lessons written in blood over Rangoon and the jungles of Burma, and Boyington carried them home when he left the American Volunteer Group. They would prove decisive over the Solomons. He rejoined the Marine Corps on September 29, 1942, receiving the rank of Major. He served as Executive Officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 122 on Guadalcanal and briefly commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 112. In both assignments, he was competent, restless, and frustrated. He had combat experience that most Marine pilots lacked. He had skills that were going unused. And he had a personality that did not fit comfortably inside the chain of command. He was, in the language the military uses for men like him, a problem. But he was a problem who could fly. In the late summer of 1943, Boyington got the chance that changed everything. Marine Fighting Squadron 214 had been deactivated after its previous combat tour, and the Marine Corps needed to reconstitute it with new pilots. What Boyington received was not a hand-picked team of elite aviators. He received what the assignment pipeline gave him: replacement pilots from various squadrons, men who for one reason or another were available, unattached, or in some cases, unwanted elsewhere. Cast-offs, extras, men between assignments. Boyington understood these men, because he was one of them. He had spent his entire career as the man who did not quite fit, the pilot who was too good to dismiss and too difficult to promote. He looked at a squadron of replacements and misfits and saw not a problem but a weapon. The pilots wanted to call themselves Boyington's bastards. A Marine public relations officer named Captain Jack Deschamps told them the name was unprintable in newspapers. The squadron settled on the Black Sheep, and they kept the heraldic bend of bastardy on their squadron crest as a private joke and a point of pride. They flew the Vought F-4U Corsair, a gull-winged, barrel-nosed fighter that was the first American aircraft in the Pacific to be genuinely superior to the Mitsubishi A6M0 in speed, climb rate, and diving performance. The Corsair was not more maneuverable than the Zero. In a turning fight at low speed, the Zero could still kill a Corsair pilot who made that mistake. But the Corsair could dictate the terms of the engagement. It could choose when to fight and when to break away. It could dive through a formation, fire, and pull up before the Zeros could follow. In the hands of a pilot who understood energy fighting, the Corsair was devastating. The Navy had initially rejected it for carrier operations because its long nose obscured the pilot's view during landing approaches, So the Marines got it first, flying from island airstrips where the landing characteristics were less critical. It was, in a sense, a misfit aircraft assigned to a misfit squadron, and the pairing was perfect. Among the pilots who arrived to fill out the Black Sheep roster were men who would become legends in their own right, though none of them knew it yet. There was John Bolt, a calm, precise Floridian who would become the only Marine jet ace in history. There was Christopher McGee, whom the squadron would call Wild Man, a pilot whose aggression in the air bordered on the pathological and whose post-war life would prove even more unpredictable than his nickname suggested. There was Don Fisher and Bill Case and Roland Rinneberger and Henry Bourgeois, men whose names appear in after-action reports and intelligence summaries, and who, taken together, represented exactly the kind of squadron that the Marine Corps had not planned to build, a squadron held together not by institutional loyalty or shared training, but by the personality of one man. Boyington understood energy fighting. He understood it with the intuition of a man who had learned to fly before the war, fought in China before the Marines had engaged in full-scale aerial combat, and absorbed lessons that most American fighter pilots in 1943 were only beginning to encounter. He also understood something that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. He understood that a fighter squadron's greatest asset was not its aircraft, it was the belief of its pilots that they could not be beaten, and building that belief in a group of men who had been told, by the very structure of their assignments, that they were expendable, was the single most important thing he did as a commander. He built it the only way he knew how, by example. He flew the most dangerous missions himself. He positioned himself where the fighting was thickest. He took risks that made his senior officers uneasy and his pilots fanatically loyal. And he discovered, almost by accident at first, and then with increasing deliberation, that the radio could be a weapon as effective as the .650 caliber machine guns in the wings of his Corsair. The Japanese air garrison at Kahili was formidable. The airfield sat on the southern coast of Bougainville, in the Upper Solomon Islands, and it was one of the principal fighter bases protecting the approaches to Rabaul, the massive Japanese stronghold on New Britain that served as the hub of enemy air and naval power in the South Pacific. The resident units included elements of the 201st and 204th Air Groups, flying A-6M-0s, some of the most experienced fighter pilots remaining in the Imperial Japanese Navy's air service. The field was ringed with anti-aircraft positions. Approaching it without surprise was, by any reasonable assessment, asking to die. The Solomons campaign was, by the autumn of 1943, a grinding war of attrition in the air. Both sides launched sweeps and escorts and interceptions day after day over the same chain of jungle islands, the same stretches of open water, the same volcanic peaks that served as navigation landmarks. Pilots on both sides were exhausted. The Japanese, in particular, were losing experienced aviators at a rate they could not replace. The pilot training pipeline that had produced the superb naval aviators of 1941 and 1942 had been shattered by combat losses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Bismarcks. The replacement pilots arriving at Kahili and Rabaul were younger, less experienced, and given fewer flight hours before being thrown into combat. The veterans who remained were still dangerous, but there were fewer of them with each passing week. Boyington understood this asymmetry. The Corsair gave his pilots a technical advantage. The attrition of the air campaign was giving them a numerical one. What he needed was a way to force the Japanese into engagements on his terms, not theirs. The Japanese, defending their own bases, could choose when to scramble and when to stay on the ground. If they judged the approaching American formation to be too strong, they could simply refuse to engage, letting the Corsairs orbit overhead and return to base with empty gun cameras. Boyington needed a way to make refusal impossible. He needed a way to make the Japanese angry enough, or ashamed enough, or provoked enough to come up and fight even when the tactical situation said they should stay down. The radio was his solution. Boyington approached it without surprise on October 17, 1943. He led 24 Corsairs of the Black Sheep and attached squadrons on a fighter sweep directly over the airfield. The morning was clear, the kind of tropical visibility that let a pilot see for miles in every direction. which meant that the Japanese could see him as plainly as he could see them. Instead of making a single pass and withdrawing, he ordered the formation into a wide orbit over the field and began broadcasting on the open frequency. The exact words varied slightly in later retellings, because radio exchanges in 1943 were not recorded with the fidelity of modern communications, but the substance is consistent across every account. Boyington told the Japanese he was over their airfield. He told them to send up their fighters. He waited. A Japanese English-speaking radio operator responded, asking Boyington for his position. Boyington gave it again, plainly, adding that he could see their runway from where he sat. The exchange continued for several minutes while the American formation circled, and then the Japanese scrambled. More than 30 Zeros lifted off from Kahili and the surrounding satellite strips and climbed to meet the orbiting Corsairs. This was exactly what Boyington wanted. By circling at altitude and forcing the Japanese to climb up to meet him, he had reversed the oldest advantage in air combat. Normally, the attacker chose the altitude. The defender reacted. But here, the defender had been goaded into becoming the attacker, climbing into a position of disadvantage, burning fuel and energy to reach an enemy who was already established in the position of his choosing, with the speed and altitude to dictate every engagement that followed. There was another layer to the calculation that is easy to miss. When fighters scramble from a runway, they do not launch in formation. They take off one at a time or in pairs, and they climb in ragged groups, reaching the combat altitude at intervals rather than all at once. An attacking force that is already at altitude and in formation can engage the climbing defenders piecemeal, picking off pairs of fighters as they arrive, rather than facing the full defending force in a single organized mass. Boyington's provocation was not just psychological, it was structural. He was forcing the Japanese into the worst possible tactical posture, climbing, scattered, and angry, against an enemy that was level, organized, and waiting. The dogfight that erupted over Kahili lasted, by most accounts, roughly 20 minutes. Boyington personally claimed 3 kills that day. The squadron as a whole claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single Corsair. Those numbers appear in the Medal of Honor citation that was later awarded to Boyington. They are the official American figures, and they deserve honest context. Aerial combat in the Second World War produced wildly inflated kill claims on every side. When multiple pilots fired at the same aircraft, when burning planes trailed smoke and appeared to crash but recovered, when the chaos of a swirling dogfight made accurate counting impossible, every air force in the war overcounted its victories. The Japanese did it. The British did it. The Germans did it. The Americans did it. Modern historians, working from both American and Japanese records, have concluded that the actual number of Japanese aircraft lost over Kahili on October 17 was almost certainly far lower than 20. Some analyses place the figure in the low single digits. This does not diminish what Boyington and the Black Sheep accomplished that day. A successful fighter sweep over a heavily defended enemy airfield, conducted in broad daylight with 0 losses, was a genuine tactical achievement regardless of the precise enemy count. But a script that claims 100% historical accuracy must present these numbers as what they are, wartime claims, not reconciled fact. What is beyond dispute, and what matters most for this story, is the method. Boyington had taken the most psychologically aggressive approach imaginable, broadcasting his presence, mocking the enemy, and forcing them to fight on his terms, and he had made it work. The Kahili challenge was not bravery for its own sake. It was a calculated provocation designed to create a tactical advantage that no textbook had described. The radio taunting became a signature. Over the weeks that followed, as the Black Sheep continued flying combat missions across the Upper Solomons and toward Rabaul, Boyington refined the technique. The Japanese, who had English-speaking personnel monitoring American frequencies, began to recognize his voice. They taunted him back. They challenged him to come down within range of their anti-aircraft guns. On at least one occasion, he obliged, making a strafing pass across Kahili while tracers arced past his wings. On another occasion, a Japanese pilot, posing as a friendly ship on a common frequency, asked Boyington for his altitude, a transparent attempt to set up an ambush by positioning fighters at the reported height. Boyington gave an altitude 5,000 feet below his actual position. The Japanese fighters positioned themselves accordingly. Boyington then dove out of the sun, passing through the altitude he had reported, and attacked the ambushers from above. The deception, the counter-deception, and the immediate follow-through captured everything about the way Boyington thought about combat. The radio was not a distraction. It was the opening move. What his superiors and the press saw was a swashbuckler, a maverick, a man who seemed to treat the war like a personal adventure. What the Japanese on the receiving end experienced was something more methodical and more dangerous. Boyington's taunts were not ego, they were bait, and the trap behind the bait was a man who had been flying combat since Burma, who understood the strengths and limitations of the Zero better than most pilots in the theater, and who had positioned his squadron exactly where he wanted it before the first word left his mouth. By late December of 1943, Boyington's combined tally, counting both his Marine kills and the disputed credits from the American volunteer group, had climbed to 25. The standing American record was 26, held jointly by Eddie Rickenbacker from the First World War and Marine ace Joe Foss from Guadalcanal. The Marine Corps, the press, and Boyington himself all wanted that record, and on January 3, 1944, he went out to get it. The mission was a fighter sweep over Rabaul, the most dangerous target in the South Pacific. Rabaul's Simpson Harbor sheltered a major Japanese naval force, and its complex of 5 airfields hosted hundreds of aircraft. The anti-aircraft defenses around the port were dense enough to turn the sky black with flak. Every pilot who flew over Rabaul knew that the odds of being hit were not theoretical, they were arithmetic. Fly enough missions over Rabaul, and the arithmetic caught up with you. It was a question of when, not whether. Roughly 48 American fighters, Corsairs and Hellcats drawn from multiple squadrons, launched that morning from forward bases in the Solomons. For Boyington, this mission carried a weight beyond tactics. He was approaching the end of his squadron's combat tour. In a matter of days, the Black Sheep would rotate off the line and return to a rear area for rest and refit. If he was going to tie or break the record, the opportunities were running out. He needed one more confirmed kill to reach 26. The press had been tracking the race for weeks. The pressure was not imaginary. Boyington was flying with his wingman, Captain George Ashman, a pilot from Far Hills, New Jersey, who had been with the Black Sheep through their entire combat tour. Ashman was not the most celebrated pilot in the squadron, but he was one of the most trusted. He flew Boyington's wing, which meant he was responsible for watching the section of sky that Boyington could not see, while Boyington focused on the target ahead. It was a job that required discipline, positioning, and the willingness to sacrifice personal glory for the safety of the lead. Over Rabaul that morning, Boyington engaged a formation of Japanese fighters. He claimed at least one kill, bringing his total to 26 and tying the record held by Rickenbacker and Foss. Those claims, like all aerial victory claims of the war, were accepted by Marine intelligence at the time, but have been questioned by historians since. The Japanese air groups defending Rabaul that day, primarily the 204th and 253rd Air Groups, reported their own losses, and the numbers do not match the American claims. The same is true in reverse. The Japanese claimed 8 Corsairs shot down that morning. The actual American losses were 2 aircraft, Boyington and Ashman. Overcounting was universal, symmetrical, and a feature of every air force in the war. What happened next is not disputed. Boyington's Corsair was hit. Whether the fatal damage came from a Zero's guns or from the anti-aircraft batteries around Rabaul, he was never certain. His aircraft caught fire. He went into the water near Cape St. George, in the strait between New Britain and New Ireland, wounded in the left leg by a bullet, his scalp torn open, shrapnel embedded in his arms, groin and shoulders, and his left ear nearly severed. He floated in his life vest for approximately 8 hours. The sea around Rabaul was warm, but it was also full of sharks, and the strait between New Britain and New Ireland was one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of water in the Pacific. Japanese patrol boats crisscrossed it daily. American submarines lurked beneath the surface. The only certainty for a downed pilot in these waters was that someone would find him. The question was who? George Ashman did not surface. His body was never recovered. He was 24 years old. He had been Boyington's wingman on the most dangerous missions of the Black Sheep's combat tour, and he had been the only pilot in position to confirm what Boyington had done over Rabaul that morning. With his death, the exact number of kills Boyington scored on January 3 became a matter of one man's word. The Marine Corps accepted that word after the war, crediting additional victories from that final mission and bringing his official total to 28. But Ashman was the witness, and Ashman was gone. As darkness approached, a shape broke the surface of the water near Boyington. It was the conning tower of a Japanese submarine, I-181, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Taoka Kiyoshi. The submarine crew pulled Boyington aboard, treated his wounds with basic first aid, and took him below. The crew of I-181 did not know that the bleeding, half-drowned American they had fished from the strait was the same man whose voice had been taunting their pilots over Kahili for months. To them, he was a downed enemy aviator, a prisoner to be delivered to intelligence. They gave him water, they bandaged his wounds. They treated him, by Boyington's own account, with a decency that contrasted sharply with what awaited him on land. 13 days later, I-181 was depth-charged and sunk in Vitiaz Strait, off the coast of New Guinea, with the loss of all 89 men aboard. The men who had pulled Boyington from the sea were dead before the month was out. It is one of the war's smaller ironies that the crew who saved his life were themselves lost within 2 weeks, in a strait barely 200 miles from the water where they had found him. Boyington never spoke about the crew of I-181 with anything other than respect. They were the enemy. They were also the reason he was alive. For the United States Marine Corps, Gregory Boyington was missing in action, presumed dead. His name was added to the casualty lists. Condolences were prepared, and in March of 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized the Medal of Honor in Boyington's name to be awarded, the paperwork noted, posthumously. His citation covered the period from September 12, 1943 through January 3, 1944. It specifically described the Kahili challenge, noting that he had persistently circled the airdrome and boldly challenged the Japanese to send up planes. It credited him with the personal destruction of 26 enemy aircraft. It was the official record of a dead hero. Boyington was not dead. He was in a place worse than anything he had experienced in combat. The Japanese transferred him from Rabaul to the great naval base at Truk, where he arrived just as American carrier aircraft launched Operation Hailstone, a massive 2-day strike that destroyed over 200 Japanese aircraft and sank more than 40 ships in the lagoon. Boyington sheltered in a slit trench, while Hellcats strafed the runway, and the transport aircraft that had carried him to Truk was destroyed on the ground. He watched American bombs fall on the base where he was being held, knowing that the pilots dropping them believed he was dead. From Truk, he was moved through Saipan and Iwo Jima to mainland Japan, arriving at a facility called Ofuna, near Yokohama. Ofuna was not a normal prisoner of war camp. It was a secret interrogation center operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy, and its existence was never reported to the International Red Cross. The prisoners held there, primarily captured aviators and submariners of high intelligence value, were classified not as prisoners of war, but as unarmed combatants. This classification, which had no basis in international law, meant that the protections of the Geneva Convention did not apply. There were no Red Cross inspections. There were no relief packages. There were no letters home. To the outside world, the men at Ofuna did not exist. The conditions were designed to break resistance. Rations consisted of small portions of rice, often mixed with straw, occasionally supplemented with fish that was frequently spoiled or infested with maggots. Beatings were routine. Interrogations were prolonged. Boyington lost nearly 50 pounds during his time at Ofuna. He was held there for approximately a year before being transferred to Omori, a larger camp near Tokyo, where conditions were marginally less brutal. At Ofuna and Omori, Boyington found himself among men whose stories matched or exceeded his own. Richard O'Kane, the most decorated submariner in American naval history, commander of the submarine USS Tang, was a fellow prisoner at Ofuna after his own vessel was sunk by a circular running torpedo. Louis Zamperini, the Olympic distance runner who had survived 47 days adrift on a life raft after his bomber crashed into the Pacific, was at Ofuna when Boyington arrived. These men, each of them broken down by starvation, beatings, and isolation, sustained each other through the final months of the war in ways that none of them spoke about publicly for decades. The guards at Ofuna used a system of punishment that was calibrated to destroy resistance without killing the prisoner. Beatings were administered for infractions as minor as making eye contact with a guard, speaking out of turn, or failing to bow deeply enough. The interrogations focused not only on military intelligence, which most prisoners had ceased to possess within weeks of capture, but on psychological pressure. Prisoners were told that their country had forgotten them. They were told that Japan was winning the war. They were shown fabricated newspaper articles describing American defeats that had never occurred. For a man like Boyington, whose entire sense of self was built on action, on doing something, on being the man in the cockpit who made the decision, the enforced passivity of captivity was its own form of torture. And yet the same quality that had made him impossible to manage as a junior officer, the stubborn refusal to accept the situation as presented, kept him alive as a prisoner. He argued with guards. He stole food when he could. He maintained, in the face of evidence that should have extinguished it, the conviction that the war would end and that he would survive it. Whether that conviction was courage or delusion is a question that perhaps only another prisoner of war could answer, but it worked. He was still alive when the bombs fell on Hiroshima. Consider what captivity meant for the man who had dared the enemy to come up and fight. The voice that had taunted Japanese pilots over Kahili was now silenced. The pilot who had circled enemy airfields with contemptuous patience was now confined to a space smaller than the cockpit of his Corsair. The commander who had built a squadron of misfits into the most feared fighter unit in the Solomons was now a number in a camp ledger that no one outside Japan would ever read. For 20 months, Boyington endured this. Not through stoic silence, because by every account he remained combative, argumentative, and difficult even as a prisoner. He endured it the same way he had endured everything else in his life, by refusing to become the man his circumstances said he was supposed to be. And this is the part of the story that most versions of Boyington's life skip past, because it is uncomfortable, and because it complicates the narrative of the fearless warrior. Gregory Boyington was not fearless. He was afraid of many things, most of them having nothing to do with the Japanese. He was afraid of poverty. He was afraid of failure. He was afraid of the version of himself that emerged when the fighting stopped, and there was nothing left to do but sit with the wreckage of his personal life. The drinking that had plagued him before the war, that had contributed to his divorce, and his debts, and his departure from the American volunteer group, was not a character flaw separate from his combat record. It was the other side of the same coin. The men who flew with him understood this duality, even if they could not have articulated it. They saw a commanding officer who was harder on himself than he was on anyone in the squadron. They saw a man who pushed himself into the most dangerous position in every engagement, not because he had a death wish, but because leading from the front was the only kind of leadership he trusted. They saw the drinking, too. They saw the nights when he sat alone, and the mornings when he climbed into the cockpit, with the residue of those nights still visible in his face. And they followed him anyway, because the thing he did in the air was so far beyond ordinary competence that the things he did on the ground could be forgiven. It is, however, a true one. The audacity that defined him in the air, the willingness to dare the enemy on an open frequency, the readiness to stake his life and his squadron's lives on a gamble that no doctrine supported, came from the same place as the recklessness that defined him on the ground. He was a man who could not do anything halfway. In combat, that quality was heroism. Out of combat, it was self-destruction. And the tragedy of his life, the part that the Medal of Honor and the television show and the legend never adequately captured, was that the war gave him the only context in which his particular kind of intensity was not just tolerated, but celebrated. When the war ended, that context vanished, and nothing replaced it. But this deeper truth does not diminish what he did. It makes it larger, because the man over Kahili was not a Hollywood hero, unburdened by doubt, performing courage as naturally as breathing. He was a man carrying every failure he had ever accumulated, every debt, every broken promise, every bottle, and choosing, in the cockpit, to turn all of it into something that mattered. The dare was real precisely because the man making it had so little left to lose. That is not the absence of fear. It is something more difficult. It is the decision to act as though fear is irrelevant, made by a man who knows exactly how much he has to fear. In August of 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. In the days that followed, American aircraft began flying over the prisoner of war camps, dropping supplies by parachute. At Omori, the prisoners who could still move went to work on the roof. Using tooth powder, the only white substance available in quantity, they painted a message visible from the air. It read, "Pappy Boyington here." The pilots above saw it. Word reached the fleet. The Marine Corps confirmed that Major Gregory Boyington, presumed dead for 20 months, was alive. He was liberated from Omori on August 29, 1945. He weighed roughly 110 pounds, down from the 170 he had carried into combat. His ribs were visible beneath his skin. His teeth were loose from malnutrition. He had spent the final weeks of the war listening to the drone of B-29 bombers passing overhead on their way to firebomb Tokyo, close enough that the prisoners could feel the heat of the burning city on the wind. He was flown to Guam, then to the United States, where he arrived to a reception that was part celebration and part resurrection. His photograph appeared on the cover of Life magazine. Newspapers ran the story of the dead hero who had returned. The country that had written his Medal of Honor citation in the past tense discovered that the subject was alive and demanding a stiff drink. On October 4, 1945, he stood before General Alexander Vandergrift, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and himself a Medal of Honor recipient for his command at Guadalcanal, and received the Navy Cross for his actions in the Solomons. The Navy Cross is the second highest decoration for valor in the naval services, and on any other day it would have been the culminating honor of a distinguished career. But for Boyington, it was the preliminary. The following day, October 5, 1945, Boyington walked into the White House. President Harry Truman was hosting a ceremony that had been designated Nimitz Day, honoring Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and the men who had fought under his command. 14 medals of honor were presented that afternoon. Boyington's was one of them. The medal had been authorized more than a year earlier for a man the government believed was dead. Now the recipient was standing in front of the president, alive, emaciated, and, by his own account, badly in need of a drink. The citation read, in part, that Major Boyington had led a formation of 24 fighters over Kahili on October 17, and, persistently circling the airdrome where 60 hostile aircraft were grounded, boldly challenged the Japanese to send up planes. It credited him with personally destroying 26 enemy aircraft during the citation period, and it concluded by noting that his forceful leadership developed the combat technique and teamwork of his pilots to a skill that enabled them to maintain the devastating pace of their air assault. That last phrase, the devastating pace of their air assault, was not decoration. It was the official verdict of the United States government on what the radio taunt had accomplished. The years after the war were unkind to Gregory Boyington. The things that made him extraordinary in combat, the intensity, the defiance, the need for action, made civilian life nearly impossible. He drank. He struggled to hold jobs. He worked as a beer salesman, a wrestling referee, and in a series of other positions that bore no resemblance to what he had done in the Solomons. He married several more times. None of the marriages lasted. The money from his celebrity evaporated. The man who had commanded the Black Sheep found himself, more than once, closer to destitution than anyone wearing the Medal of Honor should have been. It was a pattern that repeated across the generation. Men who had performed acts of extraordinary valor in combat returned to a civilian world that did not know what to do with them and that they did not know how to navigate. The skills that mattered most in the Pacific, decisiveness under fire, physical aggression, the ability to function without sleep or safety, were not skills that transferred to selling insurance or managing an office. Boyington's post-war struggle was his own, but it was not unique. In 1958, he published his memoir, titled Black Sheep. The book spent more than a year on the bestseller list. It was vivid, profane, unapologetic, and, by the assessment of historians who later checked its claims against official records, not entirely reliable. Boyington embellished. He inflated. He shaped the narrative to fit the version of himself that he wanted the world to see. His intelligence officer, Frank Walton, a former Los Angeles County lifeguard, law enforcement officer, and member of the 1948 United States Olympic water polo team, later wrote his own book, Once They Were Eagles, which tracked down 34 of the 51 original Black Sheep and told the story with considerably more restraint. In 1976, the National Broadcasting Company aired a television series based loosely on Boyington's memoir, starring Robert Conrad, and created by Stephen Cannell. The show ran for 2 seasons, 37 episodes, before being cancelled in the spring of 1978. It made Boyington famous again, to a new generation, but it bore so little resemblance to the actual history of the Black Sheep that the squadron's veterans protested publicly. Boyington himself served as a technical advisor and appeared in 3 episodes, but he privately dismissed the series with a candor that surprised no one who knew him. He called it, according to multiple accounts, a combination of inaccuracies and Hollywood nonsense. He took the money. He did not pretend it was the truth. And there is one more piece of the story that a truthful account must address, because it reveals something important about how legends work and how they distort the very history they claim to honor. For decades after the war, a Japanese pilot named Masajiro Kawato claimed publicly that he was the man who had shot down Pappy Boyington on January 3, 1944. The story gained traction in the late 1970s when Kawato and Boyington met in person during the filming of the television series and appeared together in what was presented as a reconciliation between former enemies. It was a compelling narrative. The man who shot him down, the ace and his conqueror, the handshake across the decades. It was also false. Historian Henry Sakida, working from Japanese flight records of the 204th and 253rd Air Groups for January 3, 1944, demonstrated that Kawato, who was flying in the number 3 position of a 4-plane covering element, was not engaged in the combat that brought Boyington down. Kawato's claim appeared for the first time in a 1978 English-language book, conveniently published 2 years after the television series had made Boyington's name commercially valuable again. Sakida quoted the former president of Japan's National Defense Agency, who called Kawato's assertion groundless and without a basis in fact. The Japanese Navy, from mid-1943 onward, credited aerial victories collectively to the air group rather than to individual pilots. No single Japanese airman can be identified as the pilot who shot down Boyington. The identity of the man, or the anti-aircraft battery, that ended his combat career remains unknown. This matters because the Kawato myth became, for years, part of the Boyington legend. It appeared in television specials, magazine articles, and popular histories. It was repeated until it felt true, and its exposure as a fabrication is a reminder that the most important thing about any historical account is not whether it makes a good story, but whether it happened. The story of what actually happened over Rabaul on January 3 is, in every way that counts, more remarkable than the myth. A man fought, was shot down by an enemy who remains nameless, floated alone in hostile waters for 8 hours, was rescued by a submarine whose entire crew would be dead within 2 weeks, and survived 20 months of captivity that the outside world did not know he was enduring. No fabricated antagonist can improve on that. The Black Sheep themselves scattered after the war, as all squadrons do. Captain John Bolt, who had scored 6 confirmed victories with the squadron, went on to become the only United States Marine Corps jet ace, shooting down 6 Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters while flying on exchange with the Air Force during the Korean War. He earned the Navy Cross for a single action on July 11, 1953. Of the thousands of Marine aviators who served in the Second World War and Korea, he alone became an ace in both conflicts. First Lieutenant Christopher McGee, whom the squadron called Wild Man, finished the war as the second highest-scoring Black Sheep pilot with 9 confirmed kills. He received the Navy Cross. After the war, his life took a path as unpredictable as his nickname suggested. He flew combat aircraft for the Israeli Air Force during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. He later served a prison sentence for bank robbery. He died in 1995. Frank Walton, the intelligence officer who had kept the squadron's records and later wrote its most reliable history, outlived nearly all of his comrades. In the decades after the war, he became the guardian of the squadron's factual record, pushing back against embellishments and inaccuracies with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had been there and kept notes. George Ashman, the wingman who went into the water over Rabaul and never came back, has no grave. He is memorialized on the tablets of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. He was 24. Gregory Boyington died on January 11, 1988, in Fresno, California. The cause was lung cancer. He was 75 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors 4 days later. His grave, by coincidence, sits near the grave of the boxing champion Joe Louis. A friend of Boyington's remarked that the old man would not have to go far to find a good fight. The airport at Coeur, Idaho, the town where he was born under a name he did not know, was renamed Pappy Boyington Field in 2007. It is a small airport, serving a small town, in a state that most Americans cannot find on a map. But the name on the terminal is one that Japanese radio operators heard through the static 70 years ago, circling above them, inviting them to come up. There is a tendency, when telling stories about men like Gregory Boyington, to sand down the edges, to present the Medal of Honor and leave out the alcoholism, to celebrate the dare over Kahili and ignore the debts, to describe the combat and skip the captivity, to show the hero and hide the man. This story has tried not to do that, because the man is the point. The dare over Kahili did not come from a man who had everything under control. It came from a man who had almost nothing under control except the one thing that mattered at that moment, the aircraft beneath him and the enemy in front of him. He found clarity in the cockpit that he could never find on the ground. He built a squadron of misfits into something formidable because he recognized in them the same quality he carried himself, the knowledge that being discarded does not mean being useless. When he told the Japanese to come up and fight, he was not performing. He was doing the only thing he had ever been truly good at. And the reason the dare worked, the reason it has endured in the military record and in the public imagination for more than 80 years, is that he backed it up. Not with perfection, not with unblemished numbers or a clean post-war life, or a legacy free of controversy. He backed it up with 20 planes in the air behind him, a finger on the trigger, and the absolute willingness to stake everything on the next 60 seconds. The Medal of Honor citation calls it forceful leadership. The press called it recklessness. His pilots called it something else. They called it trust. They trusted him because he did not ask them to do anything he would not do first, louder, and in full view of the enemy. That is not a common quality. It is not a comfortable quality, and it is not a quality that translates easily into peacetime. But in the skies over Bougainville, in the autumn of 1943, it was exactly the quality that the moment required. Boyington knew it too. Years later, after the celebrity had faded, and the debts had returned, and the drinking had taken everything the war had given him, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about him. His answer, reported in multiple interviews, was simple. He said he was just a Marine. He was not just a Marine. He was a man who looked at the worst the enemy could put in the air, keyed the microphone, and said, "Come up and fight." And then, when they came, he fought. That is enough. That is more than enough. Thank you for spending these minutes with Pappy Boyington and the Black Sheep. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Pacific, in a cockpit, or on a deck, or in a foxhole on an island, whose name they could barely pronounce, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.